Hello and welcome to this week's reflections on the Revelation of John. And if you're watching this video on our YouTube channel, please take a moment and below this video click on the subscribe button if you haven't done that before. And if you appreciate this video, give me a thumbs up icon. That'll help us reach more people. If you have any questions or thoughts or concerns, feel free to leave comments on this YouTube video, below YouTube video, in the comment section, and I'll try to get back to you as best as I am able. So we left off last time with the opening of chapter 14 and a few verses in, talking about the angel who brings the eternal gospel to all the earth, and the sense that this eternal gospel, even though it is using the Greek word euangelion, which means good news, literally, it's not such good news. It's bringing the news of God's wrath. And it's also not specifically Christian. Jesus Christ is not even mentioned in this eternal gospel. Yet it is broader than that. Okay, so it's, as I said last time, it is pre-Christian, it is Christian, it is post-Christian, if there ever is such a thing. So that is the first angel, and then I told you again we would stop there, and we would pick up with the information of the second angel. So that's where we're at. The second angel follows with a message apparently directed to the same audience, in other words, everyone on the earth. This time the message focuses specifically on Babylon the Great, an ancient city about which we've heard nothing so far in the book of Revelation. Like other cities, Babylon is personified as a woman, in this case an immoral woman, or some verses, some translations might say a prostitute. And the angel's proclamation echoes the Old Testament prophet Isaiah chapter 21 verse 9, fallen is Babylon, and all the images of her gods lie shattered on the ground. And also Jeremiah, Old Testament prophet, chapter 51 verse 7, which reads, Babylon was a golden cup in the Lord's hand, making all the earth drunken. The nations drank of her wine, and so the nations went mad. So the new element in this text of Revelation is the definition of Babylon's wine as the maddening wine of her adulteries. We will hear more of Babylon and her wine in chapter 16, and specifically verse 19, but also throughout chapters 17 and 18. For now, it remains simply an allusion to the prophets and to Israel's memory for the oppression at the hands of a foreign empire so long ago, when Babylon was that empire, as opposed to John's era, when he's writing this, when Rome is that empire that's doling out persecutions. So we see in this sense, the Babylon the Great is also linked somehow to the two beasts, and the more contemporary oppression described in the preceding chapter, that is chapter 13. The voice of the third angel makes it explicit. If anyone worships the beast and the image and receives the mark of the beast on the forehead or on the hand, he too will drink of the wine of God's fury, which has been poured out full strength into the cup of his wrath. Verse 9, compare that to chapter 13, verses 15 and 16. So this warning confirms our suspected link between the beasts of the preceding chapter 13 and Babylon here in chapter 14, with the wine of God's fury as Babylon's appropriate punishment for the maddening wine of her adulteries in verse 8. Yet for the first time, being Babylon the Great remains unidentified. John's original readers may have known her identity, although we do not, at least not yet, without looking ahead to chapter 17. Remember, I said back in the beginning, we want to take this as if we're receiving John's writing without any future knowledge of what happens. It's just we're taking it as it comes. So we don't have that knowledge yet at verse 17. We're just here in in chapter 17. We're just here in chapter 14. Now the third angel adds that those who worship the beast and receive its image will be tormented with burning sulfur in the presence of the holy angels and of the Lamb, in verse 10. The smoke of their torment will ascend forever, and they will have no rest day or night, according to verse 11. Although the language of this verse has contributed to mightily to a lot of traditional Christian images of hell, it's difficult to say whether hell, as commonly understood, is in view here as John is writing this vision. Now, I want to give you a reminder. The Jewish religion did not teach about heaven and hell as places of reward or punishment. They taught that all people, whether good or bad, go to a place they called Sheol after dying from these mortal bodies. So for us to put hell into this context, that's a post-Jewish and even post-Greek or Hellenistic concept. Why, for example, is the torment going on in the presence of the holy angels and of the Lamb? That apparently makes the torment going on in heaven itself, not hell. So the announcement here seems related to a celebration of Babylon's doom 5 chapters later. That's in chapter 19, verse 1, which would read, or verse 3, which would read, Hallelujah, the smoke from her goes up forever and ever. And the celebration also goes on in chapter 19, verse 1, and probably both of those scenes early in chapter 19 are momentary previews of hell and hell's finality in what is called the lake of fire, which we'll see in chapters 19, 20, and 21. Not necessarily in reality itself, yet remember this is a vision. It's not John looking into hell, it's John seeing a vision of what is happening and how he is describing it. There's really no way to be certain whether the word to Christian believers that immediately follows in verse 12 is a continuation of the third angel's speech, or is it simply John's prophetic appeal to his readers? In the manner of chapter 13, verse 10, this calls for patient endurance and faithfulness on the part of the saints. So the words here in this chapter are virtually the same. This calls for patient endurance on the part of the saints who obey God's commandments and remain faithful to Jesus. Compare that back even to chapter 12, verse 17. So the effect of placing the appeal here is to make the alternatives, either worshiping the beast and receiving its mark or remaining faithful to Jesus Christ, as clear and as stark as possible. John wants his readers to know there's only two options in these last days as they are described. You either worship the beast and receive the beast's mark, or you remain faithful to Jesus Christ. You can't do both. There is no middle ground there. So, verse 13. The series of angels flying overhead is abruptly interrupted by a voice from the same direction, that is, coming from heaven. And this voice, like the prophetic appeal preceding it, is directed to Christian readers. It is addressed to John first, and then the voice commands him write this, with the intention that what he writes will go out to the 7 congregations. In both pronouncement, verses 12 and 13, the time frame is no longer the future that John has been scanning in his vision. Rather, it's the present in which both John and the 7 congregations live. So the reason for saying this is the phrase, "who from now on die in the Lord." Why is that significant? Well, in the vision that began at verse 1, the number of the martyrs was complete, if you'll remember, at 144,000. Yet here, so many verses later, the number is not yet complete. More will die in the Lord, and they are pronounced blessed. So the Spirit, in reply, defines blessedness. Yes, verse 13 says, "They will rest from their labor, for their deeds will follow them." So this situation recalls the 5th seal, if you can think way back to chapter 6, verse 11, where the souls of the martyrs were told to wait, or literally it should be translated, just rest, until their number was complete. Well, in both passages, those who die as martyrs are said to be at rest, in contrast to the worshipers of the beast, for whom there is no rest, day or night, forever. Verse 11. The martyrs' rest is from their labor in the sense of the toil and the hardship, and the Spirit adds that their deeds will follow them. So the martyrs' wearisome efforts will be over, and their accomplishments follow them into heaven. You can contrast that with Hebrews 4:10, where Christians do rest from their work or their works, just as God did after creation. So in the message to the 7 congregations now, the risen Jesus knew both the hardships and the lasting accomplishments of the people. He was able to tell whether their good deeds were genuine, and in the case of the martyrs, there is no question about their deeds, for they die in the Lord, having maintained their faith and obedience to the end, till their life ended. The time-honored custom of reading this verse 13 at funerals suggests that the prophetic announcement could apply not just to the martyrs in the strictest sense of the word, but to all Christian believers. Nothing is much said in the book of Revelation about natural death from sickness or accident or natural causes, as it used to be put. Now the death certificates probably would read failure to thrive rather than natural causes. So there's so much violence in this society that we're reading about, in which the book was written. The emphasis is almost entirely on persecution and martyrdom rather than natural death or failure to thrive or any kind of illness or accident. Yet, if any text in the book is applicable to natural death, this one is. Verse 13. The outlook is much the same as that of an early 20th century Jewish text that has nothing to do with martyrdom. And that work reads, "Moreover, at the time of a man's departure, or woman's, neither silver nor gold nor precious stones nor pearls, go with him, but only the law and the good works." So you can see some similarity about the good works and the faithfulness. Probably John's intent is that the martyrs die first. They are first, the 144,000. They are the first fruits, if you remember that language. And beyond them, all who die in the Lord, that is, the faithful Christ followers, have the right to the claim of the promises of verse 13 as well. So there are more to die in the Lord, practicing their faithfulness and obedience. Looking now to verses 14 through 16. The series of angels in the sky continues without a specified number, but it says 2 pairs appear. So we're thinking 4. An angel seated on a cloud, not flying, holds a sickle. And then another angel, the other half of that pair, comes and commands that first angel, reap a harvest with the sickle. And this happens twice, so that the harvest takes place over 2 stages. The first of the 4 is not called another angel, the first of the 4 angels, like we heard about in verses 6, 8, and 9. Rather, this one is titled, Like a Son of Man, in contrast to the angel with the eternal gospel, verse 7, who looked or flew, maybe like a bird or an eagle, something with wings. This figure looks more like a human being, like you and I. In contrast to the one like a son of man in John's opening vision of chapter 1, verse 13, this figure in chapter 14 is never identified as Jesus, or never identifies himself as Jesus. Still, it's tempting to think that this figure as Jesus because he's seated on a cloud. And that recalls some of the imagery we've grown up with in Jesus as the Son of Man is coming in the clouds, according to Mark chapter 13, verse 26, or on the clouds, according to Matthew chapter 24, verse 30, and will send his angels to gather his elect from the 4 winds, that coming from Mark's gospel in chapter 13, verse 27. And probably the vision is intended to conjure up this idea of Jesus, but not in a literal sense, okay? This figure does not send the other angels. On the contrary, this figure takes orders from the other half of the pair, the angel that comes out of the temple that follows him. Verse 15. So a better interpretation may be that both of these angels, or the last 4 really, are functionally equivalent to Jesus, in that what they accomplish is what Jesus accomplishes. And in that sense, we can think of ourselves in the similar way. We call ourselves Christians, which literally should be translated as little Christs. And we are to be functionally equivalent to Jesus. We are to follow the way of Jesus. So think of it in that terms. The angel sitting on the cloud, or appearing on the cloud, does not identify self as Jesus, yet is functionally equivalent to Jesus in that the angel does what Jesus does. So this is signaled by the description of the first figure seated on the cloud in verse 14. And John will later see Christ seated on a white horse, chapter 19, verse 11, and God seated on a white throne, chapter 20, verse 11. These settings are those in which they will execute judgment. So the cry of the second angel, the other half of this first pair, take your sickle and reap, because the time for the reap has come. For the harvest of the earth is ripe, in verse 15. And this echoes the announcement of the time or the hour for God's judgment coming, in verse 7. The only difference is that now the announcement is addressed not to the humans facing the judgment, because it's too late for them already, rather to the messenger who is about to carry it out. And the messenger quickly does what he's told to do. Take your sickle and reap. He takes his sickle and reap instantaneously. So still sitting on the cloud, he swung his sickle over the whole earth, and the earth was harvested or reaped, according to verse 16. Now the other pair, the last 2 angels, in verses 17 through 20. The statement that the earth was harvested or reaped has a ring of finality to it, certainly, although the harvest is not yet over. And these are some of the confusing things that we run into in John's writing of the Revelation. Two more angels appear, a second pair, the first out of the temple in heaven in verse 17, like the angel who issued that command to harvest the earth, and the second now comes from the altar, verse 18. As before, the first angel is carrying a sharp sickle, and the second gives the order to go ahead and use it. So the harvest that now proceeds is the second of the two harvests, far more graphic, far more terrible than the earth harvest, so briefly described just shortly ago in verses 15 and 16. It is a destructive harvest carried out in fire and blood. The angel commanding it is the angel who had charge over the fire, verse 18. Perhaps the same angel who earlier took that censer, filled it with fire from the altar, and then hurled it down on the earth back in chapter 8, verse 5. Here, as in the earlier vision of chapter 8, destructive judgment comes, ironically, from the altar in heaven, the place that we consider merciful and the focus of our Christian worship. So in the first stage of the harvest, there was this generic harvest of the earth, presumably a harvest of wheat or some other grain. This one is said to be the harvest of grape, the vintage of the earth, verse 19, literally the vine of the earth. So this dark red juice of grapes suggests the image of blood and of violent death. The grape clusters are cut off with the sickle and thrown into the great winepress of God's wrath and trampled in the winepress outside of the city, and the blood flowed out of the winepress, rising as high as horses' bridles up in their mouth for a distance of 1,600 stadia, which is approximately a tenth of a mile, so approximately 160 miles worth of blood that reaches the bridle of a horse. Okay, so what's seen anywhere in the book of Revelation, at least so far, is as gruesome as this one. And moreover, why does this harvest take place in two such contrasting stages? Well, one possibility is that the harvest of the earth corresponds to the first four trumpets of chapter 8, verses 6 through 13, which affect only the natural creation, while the vintage of the earth, or the grape harvest, matches the last three trumpets, which are part of chapter 9, verse 1 through chapter 11, verse 19, which you may remember brought injury and death to humans as well as to the other parts of creation. A more likely interpretation is that this harvest, like the one John the Baptist predicted in Matthew and Luke, involves both salvation and destruction, with the emphasis on the destruction because this is seen to be punishment of the wicked from God. John the Baptizer spoke of one more powerful than I, who would clear his threshing floor and gather wheat into his barn, but burn up the chaff with unquenchable fire. You can see that in Luke chapter 3, verse 17. But instead of wheat and chaff, the vision in Revelation contrasts the bloodless harvest of the bloodless harvest of grain with the bloody winepress of God's wrath. Wow. This is a lot to imagine and take in, and I hope you're doing okay. This is not easy. I don't pretend it is, but I hope you're doing okay. Because John the Apostle has displayed so clearly the victory of the redeemed in verses 1 and 5 of chapter 14, and he will do so again in 15 verses 2 and 4. The emphasis of John's vision of harvest is on the destruction of the wicked, not the salvation of the righteous. It doesn't preclude or exclude the salvation of the righteous. His focus now is just on the destruction of the wicked. So, writing against the background of America's Civil War and the bloodbath of years, Julia Ward Howard, my mouth is not working good today. Julia Ward Howe captured something of the spirit of this graphic vision in her famous lines, "My eyes have seen the glory of the coming of the Lord. He is trampling out the vintage where his grapes of wrath are stored. He has loosed the faithful lightning of his terrible swift sword. His truth is marching on." And she wrote that at a time of the Civil War and so many misconceptions about how quickly that war would be over. It turned into years and years of killing each other and bloody battles. So in the trampling of the vintage, if the trampling of this vintage is the work of angels in this vision, it is unmistakably Christ's own work in a later passage, where the one who treads on the winepress of the fury of the wrath of God Almighty is immediately identified as King of Kings and Lord of Lords in chapter 19, verses 15 and 16. Once more, these four angels of the harvest are functionally equivalent to Jesus, the Son of Man and the Judge. Their bloody work of retribution is Jesus's as well. Now, not everyone agrees. One commentator understands the bloodbath as the deaths of Christian martyrs at the hands of their oppressors. John's purpose, this commentator says, is to make a profound disclosure about the great martyrdom to show that the bloodbath of the persecution, which might appear to be the total defeat of the church, was to the eyes of faith the ingathering of the elect and the means whereby the Son of Man would turn the slaughter of his saints into the downfall of the enemies. Well, the difficulty with this view is that the number of the martyrs is already complete according to verses 1 through 5. The grape harvest is more easily understood as God's wrath against the responsibles, those who were responsible for the deaths of the martyrs. In John's view, martyrdom is not its own reward. The martyrs are victorious only because their deaths are followed up by actual resurrection and actual judgment against their enemies. That all belongs to God. This other interpretation seems motivated more by a desire to downplay the wrath and the vengeance of God than it is by any actual language in the text. Christian piety has often followed this comprehensive disposition by pointing out that there is an ironic parallel between Christ, through his angels, treading the bloody winepress of God's wrath here, and Christ enduring God's wrath against sin on the cross by shedding his own blood. The further irony that both this judgment and the judgment of sin on the crucifixion took place outside of the city and may well be intentionally stated that way. Wow, so that takes us through chapter 14, and I'm sorry for all of that kind of graphic language, but it's there, and it was my job to talk about it. So, in preparation for next time, the next two chapters, 15 and 16, are taken as a whole, and they will talk about the 7 last plagues. So if in preparation you want to read or listen to those 2 chapters, feel free to do so, and we'll pick up there later. If you haven't already, please subscribe to this YouTube channel and give me a thumbs up if you were doing okay throughout all this bloody talk. If you're in the Sun City Center area on Sunday at 10 a.m., join us in person for worship. If you can't join us in person, please check out this YouTube channel where we live stream our Sunday morning service and then record it for later. I hope you're having a great week despite all of this bloody talk. Take care. God bless.